What are you trying to do that's going to change the world?
I think that
there's a lot of work around these blue zones around the world, a lot of them in Europe, in Italy, in Greece, in Japan. What's going on there that is driving people to get to a centenarian and supercentenarian level?
Thinking about the blue zones and thinking about what are the healthiest food in the world, ingredients in the world. So calorie restriction, as you mentioned, can extend lifespan, but water-only fasting is something that maybe 1% of people can do, kind of like chronic calorie restriction, maybe 1 or 2%.
Everybody, welcome to Moonshots. Peter Diamandis here. The conversation we're about to have is with Dr. Valter Longo. He is a professor at USC, and he's the creator of something called the fasting mimicking diet. Have you ever heard of it? It's a way to painlessly reduce your caloric intake for a 5-day period that has incredible impact on all kinds of diseases like diabetes, inflammatory disease, inflammatory bowel disease, even cancer. What you eat can change the course of your disease and really potentially extend your lifespan. One of the incredible thinkers, the author of the Longevity Diet. We're going to have a conversation about intermittent fasting, about all the details around food. This is one of my favorite subjects because it's something easily done. So if you're a longevity fan like me, let's jump in. Before I do, let me just mention I love sharing the incredible conversations I have with you. I'm committed to delivering the smartest individuals to you and having conversations that are in depth in terms of inspiration and guiding and science and technology. If that's of interest to you, please subscribe. Let's do this together. When you subscribe, it lets me know that you're interested in these subjects. All right, onwards to our episode. Everybody, Peter here. Welcome to Moonshots. We're going to be discussing a topic today that I'm super excited to learn about alongside with you. And we've talked about, sleep and exercise and supplements. Let's talk about diet today. Dr. Valter Longo, as I introduced, is really one of the world's experts in this area. Valter, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm looking forward to talking about the science and the practice of how and what and how much you should eat. Valter, normally you're at USC just down the road from me, but today you're across the Atlantic. What part of Italy are you summering in right now?
I'm actually in southern Italy in a region called Puglia.
Well, a pleasure. So let's begin. I'm super curious. Your work is the cornerstone of a lot of conversations around fasting mimicking, some of the terms we'll be talking about, the science. You've done a multitude of clinical studies here, and it really has changed the way I think about what I eat, when I eat, how much I eat. But how did you start this work? Where were you when you started thinking about dieting as part of the longevity area focus?
Yes, I actually started very early. I was a student of Roy Walford at UCLA, and he was my mentor, PhD mentor. And Roy was at the time probably the most famous person in the world for nutrition and longevity. And he was working on something called calorie restriction. And in fact, when I met Roy, he was not at UCLA. He was actually inside of this place called Biosphere 2, which was a sealed environment in Arizona. And him and other 7 people locked themselves up in that environment and stayed there for 2 years. So it was, I guess I had a major moment, let's say, a major exposure to this world. And Roy was a little bit crazy, but I think he was a real pioneer and a real dreamer. And so that was... they made a big difference on me. And then after that, I end up back to the biochemistry department working on starving bacteria and starving yeast. I think also influenced by Roy and the fact that he had been working on calorie restriction. But I went much further, and so I just say, well, what if I starve bacteria and yeast? What happens then? And since then, it was 1992, 93. That's all of it. I mean, I focused on that, let's say.
I knew Roy, and I was at the first Biosphere enclosure and then the coming out party. 2 of my friends were there, Tabor and Jane, Tabor McCallum. And I remember it was an incredible story. And just for our listeners, a group in Texas decided they were going to try and create the first experiment for a biosphere with the thought, if we eventually go to the moon or Mars or into space, we want to be able to grow our food and create a self-contained, closed economic environmental system. And so they put, I think it was 8 people inside this enclosure, a glass enclosure. The only thing that came in was sunlight. They had fish in a pond. They had crops they had to harvest and eat. And so they had to balance, they had to grow enough food for 2 years for them. And they had to balance the CO2 and the O2. And this grand experiment goes on. And the challenge was the fly in the ointment, so to speak, was the engineers didn't realize that the concrete they had used to basically build this enclosure was absorbing CO2. It was absorbing CO2, wasn't it? That was the issue. And so as you started, because the CO2 started getting absorbing out of the air, and they had 8 scientists inside this biosphere, everything is going fine. And then all of a sudden the CO2 levels are dropping and the plants are not growing as well. And all of a sudden they're on forced calorie restriction, and they reduced their caloric intake a lot, didn't they?
I mean, different members did different, right? Walford was the one, if you look at the charts, that lost the right amount of weight. I think maybe the other ones were cheating a little bit, but overall they were probably at least 10% calorie restricted. And if you look at the data, it's a pretty impressive changes, which were then confirmed by randomized clinical trials by lots of other people. And by the way, Peter, we were at the same party then, because I was there when they came out. And I remember there's a lot of interesting characters, including Timothy Leary.
Timothy Leary was
at
there.
That party.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, we're at the same exact same party, whatever that was, 40 years ago, 30 years ago. Anyway, so if I were going to ask you, Valter, what your moonshot is, what are you trying to do that's going to change the world? What's your goal?
Yes, my focus lab-wise, but also the focus of 2 foundations that I started a while ago is helping people get to 110 healthy, and with nutrition, but lots of other things. I mean, nutrition seems to be the safest and quickest way to go right now, but I think we're also working on drugs and other interventions to do that.
Well, I, for one, want to get to 110 healthy and then blast through that. And, a lot of people listening to this podcast, because we cover longevity and health a lot, as well as AI and other subjects, want to set a target. And, in the past, I think people would set a target of 80 years old or 90 years old. Some might set of 100. A friend of mine, Dan Sullivan, set 156. When I was in medical school, I remember learning that, bowhead whales could live 200 years and Greenland sharks could live 500 years. And I said, well, if they can live that long, why can't we? What's your longevity goal? How long do you want to live?
I wouldn't mind making it maybe to 125 or so. I mean, realizing how difficult that is. But I think I've seen that 110 with Salvatore Caruso here nearby in Calabria. I followed him for my entire life. And I see 117. I've seen 117 with Emma Morano in northern Italy. And she was at the time the oldest person in the world. So I've seen it happen, and I'm thinking, hey, why not? Maybe I'll get to 125, or maybe I die tomorrow.
Before we jump into the whole conversation around your particular research and this idea of a fasting mimicking diet versus an actual diet or a water fast, and we'll get into that. I'm curious your thoughts on the blue zones. There's a lot of work around these blue zones around the world, a lot of them in Europe, in Italy, in Greece, and in Japan. What's going on there, you think, that is driving people to get to a centenarian and supercentenarian level?
Yeah, so I go there a lot, especially to the one in Sardinia and to Loma Linda. And I think that Sardinia, when you look at Seulo and Villa Grande Strisaili, you realize, but also Calabria, now we've seen lots of little towns that have a very high prevalence of centenarians. And I think you realize that the genetic factor is probably much higher and more important than previously described, right? Meaning that you see lots of the centenarians saying, I had 3 or 4 brothers and sisters, and one made it to 95, one 98, one 102. And in fact, this was the case for Emma Morano. Emma had 6 brothers and sisters. All of them, I think, made it over the age of 88, which is extremely rare, almost impossible to happen in a single family. So I think in at least some of these blue zones, there is a genetic factor. And some of them, there's a lot of inbreeding, like Seulo and Villa Grande. There are these little towns on top of the mountains. Maybe a few families represent 70 or 80% of the population. So a lot of inbreeding, and we suspect that they may create like super longevity homozygosity, right? So that they get 2 copies, they eliminated the bad genes, and then they get 2 copies of the good genes. And that's what I suspect. But obviously the lifestyle is also right on, right? So a lot of exercise and really good diets. And so probably, I always say, to be Michael Phelps, you probably need everything. And so, you cannot, you got to train, but you also have to be born, right, with the right genetics. And so it wouldn't be surprising if these world records by these little villages are there because of the combination of genetics and also all the lifestyles that you can think of.
We talk a lot about extreme longevity and even the idea of longevity escape velocity, that science extends your life for more than a year, that every year you're alive. And I ask folks like David Sinclair and George Church and Ray Kurzweil, is there a limit on the human lifespan? In other words, if we're able to alter epigenetics or alter your genetics and so forth, is there any reason why we can't make it past 120, past or to 150 or greater? How do you think about that? What's the evidence you're seeing? Do you think we can get to, over the next decade, using AI and quantum chemistry, that we can move the needle and extend, to super centenarian, so to speak? Is that science fiction, or is there some rational reason to believe that's going to be within the hands of science in this next decade?
Until you say within the next decade, I had a very positive answer. I think that eventually, obviously, we're going to live a lot longer, and it's not going to be just 110. But I always cite my lab. It wasn't my discovery, but somebody in my lab in the 90s discovered the gene, the SOD mutation for Lou Gehrig's disease, right? And when they discovered that, we thought, just within 10 years, we're going to cure this disease. And so, that was probably 1994, 95. So 30 years have gone by, and we're still nowhere even beginning to cure ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. So unfortunately, the reality, even if you consider the exponential growth, and the exponential growth was also for ALS since 1990 to now, right? So we're much better than 30 years ago in lots of different things. But, people still die and suffer miserably from Lou Gehrig's disease. So it's wishful thinking in 10 years. I think as you get to 20 or 30 years, may not necessarily be wishful thinking, depending on what happens in these 30 years and some really key discoveries, especially on the safety, right? You can reprogram all the cells you want, but are you gonna put the person at risk? And remember when gene therapy was first started, one person died, and this delayed the use of it. It was a great technology, and it was just one person was enough to cause a big problem for 20 or 30 years, right? So
I remember that very well. I was in the field at MIT and Harvard at the time, and I remember the promise of gene therapy, and it stopped cold, like you said, until the safety was put in place. But even the promise of 20 or 30 years from now. So if someone's in their 40s, 50s, or healthy in their 60s, if you can make it, an extra 20 or 30 years, get to 90, then the potential to intercept these technologies may be there. And I think the other thing to remember is it's a nonlinear progression. It isn't like we're just incrementing the same amount every year. We're doubling in power with massive compute capabilities coming our way.
Yes, and I mean, I guess the goal in 30 years will be maybe to get an extra 20, 30 years, and then and then go from there, right? So yeah, I think if we achieve that, it's very achievable in the next 30 years that we add 30 years to the life. And I mean, I always say there's going to be two populations: one that does all the right things, and they may live 20, 30 years longer, and the other group, I think, is going to live probably about the same as now. But of course, yeah, with the technology, maybe we'll. I mean, I'm talking about nutrition and fasting making diets and all that. But yeah, with the technology, I think it is possible. Maybe that we'll have initial technologies that get us another 20 or 30 years, and then we have now 60 years to at least the ones of us that are in our 50s. To get there, but it's a fun, for sure. It's a fun moment, a revolutionary moment, and we just have to see what happens here.
Well, I can guarantee everyone listening to our voice and our podcast today is going to be doing the right thing. So let's jump into that. So you start your graduate work or postgraduate work, starving bacteria and yeast, and then getting to the point and realizing, I mean, there's a few very concrete things that one can do to extend the human lifespan, and caloric restriction is definitely one of them. You may not want to live that much longer if you're restricting your caloric intake radically, but it is definitely one of them. If you could walk us through the work you did at your postgraduate work through to the development of this fasting mimicking diet. But let's begin with FMD, fasting mimicking diet. What is that, and how does it compare to a regular diet?
Yeah, so calorie restriction, as you mentioned, can extend lifespan. But if you look at even mice, about a third of the mice that are placed on severe calorie restriction actually live shorter. About a third live the same, and a third live longer, right? So it's more complicated than people appreciate. And I think the FMD, coming out of Walford Lab, the FMD was a way to say, well, maybe there is a way that makes it a lot less hard for people. You could do this maybe once every 2 or 3 months, and you don't lose muscle mass like you do for calorie restriction. And and you can get all the benefits of calorie restriction. So the fasting mimicking diet is something that lasts 5 days, is plant-based, is low calorie, low sugar, low protein, high fat, and has the job really of shrinking, or at least partially shrinking the human body or the mouse, and then re-expanding, right? So it's something very simple but incredibly powerful, right? So why? Because when you shrink, you start this self-eating process, this repair process, and when you re-expand, actually, as we've shown in lots of different papers in mice, you turn on embryonic developmental genes, right? So I think that, and this is all coordinated. I talk about 3 billion years of R&D, right? Because this is really nature's way to rebuild organs and systems. And so I think it's probably going to be the first success. I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but it's the first success in causing multi-system regeneration and rejuvenation in a safe way, in an effective way, just because we're already there, and it is safe, and we already have data showing that it's effective.
So let's introduce the term autophagy, which is a term which obviously you've done a lot of extraordinary work in as well, which is when you're in this fasting mode, your body will begin to autophagy, which means to eat oneself in one sense, to start killing the senescent cells, and as you said, to shrink the body and put yourself, it's the equivalent in the seasons of life, it would be fall where you're shedding, and spring would be the return, if you would. How much dieting does it take to trigger autophagy in the body?
It looks like it needs about three. Of course, autophagy in some cells may start early, maybe 1 or 2 days of fasting. But I would say if you want to see the weight of multiple or most organs shrink significantly, you probably have to go 4 or 5 days. And that's what the FMD, the fasting mimicking diet, does. It gets to the 5 days of fasting, and that's when you begin to see reprogramming, and you begin to see the shrinking of lots of different systems. For example, if you look in people a white blood cell number, you'll see about in over 70% of the subjects, you see about a 20% decrease. So that indicating that the body is beginning the process of lowering white blood cell number, keeping them high enough, but lowering them, and also redistributing them in different places like the bone marrow.
Everybody, I want to take a short break from our episode to talk about a company that's very important to me and could actually save your life or the life of someone that you love. The company is called Fountain Life, and it's a company I started years ago with Tony Robbins and a group of very talented physicians. Most of us don't actually know what's going on inside our body. We're all optimists. Until that day when you have a pain in your side, you go to the physician in the emergency room and they say, listen, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you have this stage 3 or 4 going on. And it didn't start that morning. It probably was a problem that's been going on for some time, but because we never look, we don't find out. So what we built at Fountain Life was the world's most advanced diagnostic centers. We have 4 across the US today, and we're building 20 around the world. These centers give you a full body MRI, a brain vasculature, an AI-enabled coronary CT looking for soft plaque, a DEXA scan, a GRAIL blood cancer test, a full executive blood workup. It's the most advanced workup you'll ever receive. 150 gigabytes of data that then go to our AIs and our physicians to find any disease at the very beginning when it's solvable. You're going to find out eventually. You might as well find out when you can take action. Fountain Life also has an entire side of therapeutics. We look around the world for the most advanced therapeutics that can add 10, 20 healthy years to your life, and we provide them to you at our centers. So if this is of interest to you, please go and check it out. Go to fountainlife.com/Peter. When Tony and I wrote our New York Times bestseller, Life Force, we had 30,000 people who reached out to us for Fountain Life memberships. If you go to fountainlife.com/Peter, we'll put you to the top of the list. Really, it's something that is, for me, one of the most important things I offer my entire family, the CEOs of my companies, my friends. It's a chance to really add decades onto our healthy lifespans. Go to fountainlife.com/Peter. It's one of the most important things I can offer to you as one of my listeners. All right, let's go back to our episode. So just for reference, when Valter is speaking about the fasting mimicking diet, there's a company that's licensed his technology. It's a product I use called Prolon by El Nutra. And when you order Prolon, you get a box of day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. And these are powders or soups and some bars that you eat that are very, very specific amount of calories and specific fats and proteins that mimic dieting. The alternative in the old days was doing a water diet, right? Where I'm just drinking water, maybe some salts mixed in with the water to try and cut my caloric intake down to 0. But let's contrast 1 second the Prolon fasting mimicking diet with a water diet here to understand, is it better to go with 0 calories and just water, or is it better to go with the Prolon? And how many calories are you taking in on day 1 through 5 on the Prolon FMD?
Yeah, so obviously, eventually, if you want this to be, let's say a worldwide or certainly a popular intervention, it has to be very safe. It has to be very feasible. The majority of people have to be able to do it. And I would say water-only fasting is something that maybe 1% of people could do. Kind of like chronic calorie restriction, maybe 1 or 2%. So I've done it one time, and I still remember every day of it. And this is how the FMD started, with a clinical trial at USC Norris Cancer Center on water-only fasting. And we were convinced when we started this is like 2010 or so, when we started the trial, water-only fasting and chemotherapy, we were convinced everybody was going to do it. Highly motivated group of people. And the great majority of people did not want to do it. And the oncologists did not want them to do it. And that's when we went to the National Cancer Institute and National Institute on Aging and said, I think we need to develop a fasting mimicking diet, right? So most people don't realize this is why we studied, developed it, and tested the fasting mimicking diet. So so then it's 1,100 calories on day 1, 800 calories on day 2 to 5, and but it's the composition that matters the most, or as much. And so it's a lot of tweaking of not just the low protein, let's say, or very low protein, but also the type of protein that we use. So there's certain amino acids that interfere with the effects of fasting are so low that it's like you did not have food at all. You know?
So if I remember correctly, on the Prolon FMD, it was something like 1,200 calories the first day, then down to 800 calories for the next 4 days, or something like that?
1,100 going down to 800.
Yeah. And how many calories does a person normally take? So I'm 150 pounds, 152 pounds, something like that. I'm, in probably in my best shape in terms of percent body fat and such, and muscle. But I think about that. What's your advice for caloric intake in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, the average American, I think a male is around 2,700 kilocalories per day. But I think that it's pointless. It doesn't mean anything. It depends on energy expenditure and lots of other things, right? So it's really about your abdominal circumference, your BMI, body mass index, and so how much fat you have, how much muscle you have, and then you adjust based on that, right? So you could be eating 3,000 calories a day, and that might not be enough. Or somebody may be eating 1,600, and maybe too much. Let's say a woman weighing 100 pounds in perfect shape. So so I think it's counting calories is pointless. Much better to focus on the results of that and adjust the food based on how you respond.
All right. So the FMD here is 1,100 calories, reducing down to 800 calories, I think, for the last 3 days. And I remember when I did it, it was pretty easy to do. But my question in the back of my mind is, if I really want to cause autophagy, if I really want to make a difference and trigger my body, is it better to just do a water diet solo? And I remember speaking to the CEO of Prolon, and he said, listen, the science actually, according to the studies, were that no, actually doing a fasting mimicking diet in terms of the healthy outcome of multi-system regeneration and all of the benefits, it was better to do this reduced caloric intake versus a zero caloric intake. Is that what your research also shows?
I think he was referring to my research probably. So I think that water-only fasting can work for lots of things, right? But we compare this. Say, for example, for cancer, they work about the same, right? So if you take a mouse and you put it on water-only fasting and you do, let's say, 3 days or 4 days of fasting mimicking diet, is about the same. But of course, with the water-only fasting now, it's a much more dangerous situation for the patients. And again, most oncologists and physicians are not going to want to touch it. For all the diseases, for example, we had a paper where we compare and we looked at inflammatory bowel disease in mice. And the water-only fasting worked only about halfway to what the FMD did. And it turns out something that was a little surprising, right? It was probably the prebiotics in the FMD. So when I developed the FMD, I wanted to make it extremely healthy. So thinking about the blue zones and thinking about what are the healthiest food in the world, ingredients in the world, right? So it was made 100% with some of the healthiest food in the world. And that was a good idea, because I think this prebiotic then turned out to affect bacterial species, lactobacillus, bifidobacteria. And so we saw this jump, which we didn't see for water-only fasting. And in fact, water-only fasting increased the leakiness of the gut when the FMD was decreasing the leakiness of the gut. But the fasting, water-only fasting still worked, but it caused good and bad. And the FMD seems to be much more consistent, turning on, for example, intestinal stem cells, and increasing the level of these beneficial bacterial families, and decreasing inflammation, etc. So I think that it makes sense, right? It makes sense that having this plant-based vegan composition plus the fasting property might avoid a lot of the potential problems like leakiness of the gut, and at the same time still give you the autophagy and give you lots of the benefits. So I would say that people, of course, can decide what they want to do. I mean, it's also good that water-only fasting is free. If you must have it and you cannot buy anything, that's good. That's I always say, eventually, if that's all, if you cannot afford that and you're in some country where there is no reimbursement for it, absolutely do water-only fasting, because it's going to be still effective.
Yeah, and I mean, just so folks know, the Prolon diet is not expensive. It's a couple $100. You're going to spend a couple $100 typically on food during the 5 days anyway, unless you're a college student eating ramen noodles. But let's, 2 questions I want to hit on. One, how many times per year should I, just in terms of wanting to be in maximal shape, should I consider doing this? At once a month, once a quarter, once a year? And then what are the actual, you keep referring to mice studies, but I know there's been a lot of human studies done. What are the results of the human studies of using the fasting mimicking diet? So frequency first, and then what about some of the clinical, I think there's some 21 clinical studies that have been done by Prolon.
Yes, and there's probably another 30 either running or about to start now. So the results are very good, and the frequency, for example, for diabetes, the Heidelberg study on diabetic patients, and the Leiden study on diabetic patients did it once a month for 6 to 12 months. But the idea would be you get the diabetic, and we were surprised how compliant they were, by the way, right? So it's fairly high compliance, which we did not expect. So most of the people could complete the 12 cycles in 1 year. And so then the idea is to move it, even for the diabetic patient, maybe move it from 12 to 8 cycles on year 2, and maybe 6 cycles on year 3, and then eventually less than that. And so, but then also it's a question of risk and let's forget the diabetic, and let's say somebody's normal and wants to live longer. So obviously, probably doing it more is going to be more beneficial, but we don't know what happens if somebody does one cycle of FMD per month for 40 years, right? So, I mean, we don't know, right? So then there is always, with everything that you do so frequently, there's always some risk, and that's why we say, probably 3 or 4 times a year, if somebody is healthy and wants to optimize health. And so now we just started, well, actually 6 months ago, we started a 500 patient clinical trial here in Southern Italy, and we already recruited the first 200 patients. And that's the first time where we do the FMD once every 3 months. And so that's going to be a very interesting study, right? Now we're moving away from the once a month effect, which is over and over has been very, very effective in healthy patient and patient with lots of different diseases. But now we're moving to once every 3 months, and we'll see what happens, but we're optimistic. And by the way, in the 2017 trial we published on healthy patients, we saw reduction of IGF-1 reduction of inflammation, blood pressure, cholesterol, fasting glucose, and in the diabetes trials, that was confirmed A1C reduction in all the trials. Pretty impressive reduction of A1C, glycated hemoglobin, but also reduction in drug use, right? So most of the patients were able to reduce drugs, and that's what we think it's also very exciting about this, getting people to be disease-free. And the last thing I want to say, which was very surprising, and now that's the 5th trial, we see the same, no loss of lean body mass, right? So the great majority of diets, even the Mediterranean diet, we just got finished in a trial, and after 7 months, a subject lost about 5 pounds of muscle mass. But with the FMD, with 4 cycles, 5 days of FMD, we saw no reduction in muscle mass. And so, so that's very important. I think we looks like we got it right there.
So that's interesting, right? Because one of my objectives is adding muscle mass. So I'm, eating 150 grams of protein per day, and trying to do as much of that plant as I can. But I have some fish and chicken as well. And at 150 pounds, I'm targeting 1 gram per pound to maximize muscle, and then adding my workouts onto that. And I've always wondered, would in fact the fasting mimicking diet, because I'd be off that protein for 5 days, hit me as a reduction in lean muscle mass? And you're saying so far the results show you would not.
Yeah, especially in somebody, obviously, as you know, you have a very high protein intake. So we recommend, based on a lot of studies, a lot less. But it's your choice, obviously. But somebody that has 150 grams of protein per day, we will expect maybe the opposite, meaning gaining more muscle mass by doing the fasting mimicking diet. Also, because of what we suspect is that this break, like we see for insulin resistance, is it possible that there is we know there is IGF-1 resistance, right? So this growth, the central growth factor, at least has been shown for Alzheimer. But it's possible that by removing this, getting IGF-1 to be very low for 5 days and then going back to very high, now you may increase the sensitivity of the receptor, and therefore the receptor on the muscle mass. I mean, we don't know yet. We're looking at this right now, but there's certainly a possibility that So it looks like all the regenerative effects of the fasting mimicking diet are in fact due to the alternation of very low of these growth factors and relatively high levels of these growth factors, and potentially desensitization of the receptors.
Yeah, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, and I really appreciate this, is we are the result of hundreds of thousands or millions of years of evolutionary pressures. And as Homo sapiens, for the last, call it 1 million years for round numbers, we've gone through periods of, fasting, massive fasting, and huge rewards. And it's this cycling that our body's gotten used to, but we no longer have cycling with McDonald's and Whole Foods. We're just taking in massive caloric intake all the time. And so this could be a critical part of activation of those gene pathways that are able to benefit from the cycling. Is that assuming one of your conclusions and the thesis underlying this?
Yes, absolutely, right. So there's probably a lot of junk that accumulates, and a lot of organs that need rejuvenation and regeneration. But in the old days, for probably the entire history of any organism, not just humans, starvation was just unavoidable, right? And so now, for the first time in history, maybe the last 100 years or so, there's a lot of people that we enroll in clinical trials that have never gone more than a couple of days of fasting. And so that's probably the great majority of the population has never been exposed to any of this, right? So, and that's probably why the insulin resistance, and the cholesterol, the high cholesterol and the high blood pressure, a lot of organs that are probably waiting for that moment of reset And so they don't know what to do.
Waiting for their reset.
And they don't know what to do, and they become dysfunctional, and that's a lot of these problems. So nobody has high cholesterol at 20, right? So why is that? It may very well be that, that the organ and the system needs to go back to its original function.
I want to get to the idea of multi-system regeneration in a moment, but let me ask one other question first, which is around the notion of what diseases have you looked at treating with the fasting mimicking diet? So I heard you say cancer. I heard you say diabetes, obviously. What about general inflammatory disease? What are the lists of things that FMD could be valuable in addressing?
I think many, and the reason is that it's not the FMD that is doing the work, is the FMD that is triggering the body to really start over, right? And so we looked at inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis. We finished one trial years ago, and it was positive increase in quality of life. We just finished another trial on multiple sclerosis. We finished, we're about to finish the Alzheimer trial. About 10 clinical trials, most published on cancer. So there is 2 trials, I think now at Stanford, that on inflammatory bowel disease. So these are just some. I think there's probably another 20 or so that are running on all kinds of different diseases. So probably almost everywhere where aging is a central factor, or certainly dysfunction is a central factor, central component of the disease.
Hey everyone, I want to take a quick break from this episode to tell you about a health product that I love and that I use every day. In fact, I use it twice a day. It's Seed's DS-01 Daily Symbiotic. Hopefully by now you understand that your microbiome and your gut health are one of the most important modifiable parts of your health. Your gut microbiome is connected to everything: your brain health, your cardiac health, your metabolic health. So the question is, what are you doing to optimize your gut? Let me take a moment to tell you about what I'm doing. Every day, I take 2 capsules of Seed's DS-01 Daily Symbiotic. It's a 2-in-1 probiotic and prebiotic formulation that supports digestive health, gut health, skin health, heart health, and more. It contains 24 clinically and scientifically proven probiotic strains that are delivered in a patented capsule that actually protects the contents from your stomach acid and ensures that 100% of it is survivable, reaching your colon. Now, if you want to try Seed's DS-01 Daily Symbiotic for yourself, you can get 25% off your first month's supply by using the code PETER25 at checkout. Just go to seed.com/moonshots and enter the code PETER25 at checkout. That's seed.com/moonshots and use the code PETER25 to get your 25% off the first month of Seed's Daily Symbiotic. Trust me, your gut will thank you. All right, let's go back to the episode. So let's get to this idea. What do you mean by multi-system regeneration? Can you define that? And then what is your work showing possible there?
Yeah, so we started about 10 years ago publishing on the blood system and showing that during the fasting and fasting mimicking diet, the blood, there's a reduction in blood cells, and then the hematopoietic stem cells are self-renewing. So you have an increased population of hematopoietic stem cells. And then when you refeed, they go to work and they essentially rejuvenate the immune system. And then we went on to show similar effects in the pancreas, in the gut, in the nervous system. And now we're working, for example, we have a paper in submission for kidneys. And multi-system regeneration has to do with probably either the self-renewal of stem cells on one side or the reprogramming. So we see Yamanaka factors, these factors that can make somatic cells into embryonic like stem cells, we see Yamanaka factor. And by the way, we see different Yamanaka factors being turned on in different organs, right? Which makes sense, right? So Yamanaka had probably sort of used the brute force to reprogram cells. But the pancreas may not need all the factors, may only need a few. And so, for example, when you do the FMD and refeeding, you see the pancreas showing a profile, a gene expression profile very similar to the one activated during embryogenesis. And so that's how we know there is a real program, a very coordinated program, by the way, with different steps and lots of transcription factors and that are, orchestrating this rebuilding process. So, for example, we could take the pancreas of a mouse, destroy it with a toxin, and that's permanently, irreversibly damaged, right? So the mouse no longer makes insulin. And then we start the FMD cycles, and then you see fairly rapidly there is reprogramming of the pancreatic islet cells, and then they start making insulin again, and that's a permanent effect. So now essentially we have regenerated the insulin producing beta cells of the pancreas, and similarly we've shown it in many different systems.
That's amazing. So basically, this is a chance for the body, like you said, to clear away the old and dying cells and get rid of waste products, and to trigger a period of regrowth and revitalization, which is a normal part of life. But because we are just feeding the body constantly, it has no need to do this in the past, right? This is a chance to give the body access to normal cycles. Fascinating. Let's talk about time-restricted eating and what, just diets in general, because there are thousands of diet books. And let me just check with you. When I'm teaching people and the work that I'm doing for myself, just the basics, say there's no one diet that's right for a single individual. We have a lot of genetic and cultural backgrounds, but what I think is important is, number one, eliminate sugar to the maximum degree possible, and maximize whole plant intake to the maximum degree possible. If you had to say two things, would you agree with those two things are the most important actions for folks to take?
Yeah, sugar for sure. I think I generally agree. I will have proteins, but you put me on the spot because you eat a lot of proteins.
No, listen, I'm here to learn as well. So how much protein should a person take in? For me, my goal is maximize muscle gain for a number of reasons. And if I wanted to maximize besides the weight workouts, how much protein would you take in, and how would you maximize muscle gain?
Yeah, so I think eventually, the recommendation for people is about 0.37 grams per pound, right? So about a third of what you eat. But of course, it's not for athletes. So the athlete, my recommendation has always been increase it until you're happy with the results, right? So you go from 0.37 to 0.60. If that allows you to achieve the muscle gain that you want, then that's it. You stop at 0.60. And we suspect that maybe, as I was saying earlier, possibly by having so much protein, and having maybe very high IGF-1, you could be, overstimulating some of these growth pathways, like insulin, can lead to insulin resistance, lots of insulin. So yeah, obviously, if you eat so much protein, most people get some benefit, right? But the question is, could you get even more benefit if you eat less proteins by both? And so, we finished like a 5-year study now on mice and in looking at how you optimize frailty, muscle function, and longevity, right? And it's pretty tricky, right? So you need to have everything. There's different periods of life and different techniques, and then eventually you get the longevity extension, and you get the frailty protection, right? So yeah, I would say probably much lower. And if it doesn't affect your performance and your muscle, then I think you're much better off with let's say 0.5 than 1 per pound. Yeah.
But still sugar reduction, and that includes high glycemic index, breads and white rice and so forth. I don't want to talk about it while you're in Italy, reducing your high glycemic intake.
Yeah, it's tricky. I think the high glycemic index, obviously, in general, is a bad thing. But at the same time, we always get comments about, oh, I ate this soup or that soup, and the glycemic index go up. We suspect that if you're otherwise insulin sensitive, some of these spikes may actually be helpful, right? And maybe contributing to signaling, intracellular signaling that actually helps you maintain lean body mass. So the problem more than the glycemic index and glycemic index intake is too much of it, right? So when you have it all the time, and then you have high insulin all the time, then insulin resistance, then you got a problem, right? So, but I see your point, meaning like you're saying, people, the attention span might be limited, and so if I make it complicated, then people maybe not remembering the way to do it. But I would say the spikes itself is not really an issue unless those spikes eventually turn into insulin resistance, and then you got a big problem. So, and this is the same for the sugar, right? Obviously we work on sugar, but yeah, the great majority of people just have excess sugar, and that's a problem, right? And so I can see your point of saying, look, because there's no damage of going to very low sugar, and so I think it's a good idea. But technically, I'm thinking biochemically, there may be we're a sugar machine, right? So we in fact need to maintain the sugar at certain levels. If you start seeing patients that we follow in the clinics with blood sugar 60, we worry, right? And if you see an old person with blood sugar 60, you really have to worry, right? So you want to rather see a person with blood sugar fasting glucose of 90 than 60 because of frailty and other issues, right? So I'm saying just a complicated story, and I know that it's very hard to communicate a complicated story to millions of people. So yeah, in general, I agree with you.
So let's talk about time-restricted dieting and how many meals you should have per day. There's a lot of individuals who are, listen, I only eat one meal a day, or I only eat between a 6-hour window and have an 18-hour fast. I recently read in Peter Attia's book that the time-restricted dieting actually had no beneficial effects when studied in a large population. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that in general, if you look at all the studies, some of the large studies have shown no beneficial, I think, improvement compared to calorie restriction. But in general, it works, and it's beneficial for fasting glucose and lots of metabolic markers. The problem, if you skip breakfast, is that 16 hours is associated with a shorter lifespan and more cardiovascular disease. But if you don't skip breakfast, and then there are probably mostly benefits and no detrimental effects. I like, as such, in Panda Nose, I like the 12 to 13 hours fasting per time to the eating, because I think it's showing already very good benefits. It doesn't require skipping breakfast. It doesn't get into the range where gallstone formation is increased. So I really like that 12, 13 hours of fasting per day. I always say I've never seen any negative effects of the 12, 13 hours. And, if you think about safety first, that's probably a very good way to go. And then I practice actually skipping lunch, and I've been doing it for 30 years now. And I think that may be one of the safest meals that you can skip, especially if you replace it with a small snack. And I usually have a snack, let's say 5 p.m., but my lunch is an espresso usually, Monday to Friday. But I also alternated with weekends where I eat, and I think it's good that it takes a while for the brain to get used to it. But after about 2 months, that lunch is no longer necessary for most people that we follow. And so now, the benefits of being able to, skip the central meal without really having a difficult time achieving that.
Yeah. So if you eat dinner at not typical Italian style, typical American style, if you had dinner at 6 and you're ending at 7, then you might have a breakfast at 13 hours later at 8 a.m., skip lunch and have a dinner again at 6 that evening.
Yeah, that seems to be very safe. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was on a very time restricted, 18 hours off cycle. 12 or 13 hours off is much easier. The reason I stopped that cycle was because I was trying to increase my protein intake and my ability. You can't eat that much protein in such a short period of time. You will not absorb it. You have to spread it out during the day. But that's a different conversation.
Yeah, I think we very much look at the long-term safety, right? So that I use these 5 pillars of longevity, right? With one of them is epidemiological data, and one of them is centenarian studies, right? We follow very closely what centenarians have been doing for a long time. And so, we try to avoid things that we don't, it's like an uncertain territory or terrain. And certainly a lot of these techniques may be very beneficial, but then get you into uncertain terrain. And we could get surprised in 20 years, as I was saying earlier, about lots of different things that we do.
Well, let's take a second, because in your book, The Longevity Diet, you do talk about the 5 pillars of longevity. I think people inherently know what they are, but I'd love if you would hit them again just for thoroughness. So what are the 5 things that centenarians are consistently doing that you're seeing?
Yeah, not so much centenarians, but everybody. So the pillars have to do with the scientific and medical disciplines that feed the instructions, let's say, right, the recommendations. So the pillar is epidemiological data, and one of the pillars is clinical studies, right? So what happens if you take a lot of people and put them on a low sugar diet versus a high sugar diet? And one of the pillars is basic research on aging. So how do you make a mouse live longer, right? And can you make a mouse live longer consistently? And if you can't, it's not a good start, right? If somebody has an idea and the mouse doesn't live longer with that idea, then I would say it's not a good start for humans. And then centenarian studies, right? So that's one pillar. So the whole centenarian populations that we follow really teach us a lot. And we like to have and then the 5th pillar is complex systems. How does a plane or a car or the space shuttle age, right? So we look at things that we build, we know very well. And so what goes wrong with these machines and why? And so then the attempt of the 5 pillars to get to a common denominator that makes it fairly unlikely to change, in 5 years from now. So, I got it wrong. I thought that this was good. And so I think the 5 pillars help getting it right, and I think help getting it right for a very long time. So just the epidemiological studies, for example, it would take another 30 years to prove everything wrong accumulated so far, and meta-analysis. So I think that's a good way to approach it.
So what are the 5 things, the 5 key pillars here? Just from your book, obviously, one of them was physical activity, exercise, sleep, social engagement. Yeah, no,
I didn't talk much about social engagement. I mean, although I think it's probably important, but I'm not an expert, so I let Dan Buettner and others talk about that. But I mean, we focus on time-restricted. The longevity diet, which is a pescatarian, low-protein diet, but which increases as people get older. So after 65 is higher in protein intake. So high legume, high whole grain, nuts, etc., and maybe fish 3 times a week. Then the time-restricted eating, 12, 13 hours. Then 150 minutes of physical exercise a week, plus an hour of physical activity a day, like walking, for example. and then muscle training, maybe 3 or 4 times a week. So those are the main, and sleep. But again, I'm not an expert on sleep, and so I'd rather tell people to read the book by Matt Walker or others that truly specialize on that. But obviously, that's a very important one.
Fantastic. I think those are the basics everybody knows, but just it always helps to hear that and reinforce it.
Yeah, and sorry, I forgot the fasting mimicking diet, right? So 3 or 4 cycles of the fasting mimicking diet per year, yeah.
So yeah, I'm thinking for myself once a quarter. I'm curious, once you do that for 5 days, and then you do it 90 days later, after the 5 days, is there any evidence of how long the benefits persist?
Yeah, so we published on that, and we have another 2 or 3 clinical trials confirming long-term effects. So after 90 days from the end of the last FMD, about 60% of the significant changes were still there, suggesting that it's slowly, moving back, and probably within 6 months, you're going back to where you came from, maybe with some improvements. But yeah, it doesn't last forever. But I think that 3 to 6 months, you're going to have continued benefits.
So as we close out here, I'm curious, where's your research going next? What's exciting for you in the near future here? And if you had all of the funding research to do all of the experiments you want to do, what would you want to do?
Well, number one, I think I liked the disease part, and now we're really now moving into this can be done and it works, and so that it should go in the doctor's toolkit. So we're pushing very hard to get to conclusive data on hundreds of patients, randomized, well done studies published in leading journals. So cancer, I'm particularly excited about. I think that fasting mimicking diet can serve as a wild card, helping immunotherapy, chemotherapy, hormone therapy, et cetera, work better, and maybe, as we're seeing for lots of patients, go from disease progression delay to cancer-free survival or remission. So that's an exciting set of studies. And then, diabetes, I think we're already there. We're at trial number 4 or 5. It's pretty clear. It can reverse, it can reduce drug use and reverse. I mean, within a year, we get 15-20% of patients that are diabetes free. And I think within 2 years, it probably goes, if they follow it, goes to maybe 50%, although we haven't done that part yet. But so diabetes, I think, is the most conclusive one already. And we're excited about that. And so lots of other diseases. And then I think Alzheimer is also very interesting. I mean, obviously the drugs have not done very well with Alzheimer. And maybe, as we've done for cancer, the drugs or whatever regenerative intervention plus the fasting mimicking diet, I think that that's something that we're very excited about. And then, of course, we want to take it. So half of my group now works on these Yamanaka factors and stem cell activation, and so we want to take it to the next level, right? So David and Belmonte and others have shown that you can reprogram these cells, and we're basically saying, can we do as well, but in a natural way? And how do we get there, right? Can we get these effects that Belmonte and David had published on? Can we get it? And what kind of fasting mimicking diet? How long is that going to have to be? And do we need anything else to add to the FMD, right? So so that's what we're very excited about that, because I think that also is going to be at the center of treating diseases, as David and others are also talking about. So that's a very exciting short-term goal. By the way, I think in the next 10 years we should put it to work.
Fantastic. For those who are interested, if you go and Google Prolon, Prolon, you can get that. The company that manufactures it, L Nutra, something I like to do once a quarter. Valter, where can folks find out more about your research? On what website?
Yes, I can be followed on Instagram or Facebook, but then the createcures.org is where the clinic is in Los Angeles, and it follows a lot of people all over the United States. And then we have the Valter Longo foundation.org in Europe. And so that's how we follow people. Those that cannot afford it, it's a nonprofit clinic. Those that cannot afford it don't have to pay, as long as we have money to operate things. But I recommend that you contact the foundation, and whether it's somebody with advanced stage cancer or somebody that just wants to be healthier, that's probably the best way to go, and it's fairly inexpensive.
Fantastic. Valter, thank you for your time. Thank you for your research and the work that you're doing, and excited to spread the message about how you eat, what you eat, how much you eat. All of these things are critically important for our health, and you can do something about it. Anyway, a pleasure as always. Thank you, my friend.
My pleasure, Peter. My pleasure. Thank you.
I want to take a moment to tell you about Abundance 360, my year-round leadership mastermind for people who want to go big, create wealth, and impact the world. It's also Singularity University's highest level program. A key focus of Abundance 360 is helping my members develop their massive transformative purpose, or MTP, and also to define and execute on their moonshots. You're listening to the Moonshot Podcast, so the question is, do you have an MTP? Do you have your own moonshot? For example, my massive transformative purpose, my MTP, is to inspire and guide entrepreneurs just like you to help you create a hopeful, compelling, and abundant future for humanity. My MTP drives everything I do. It guides me. It inspires me. My books, my companies, the X Prizes we launch, it's all born out of that MTP. As an entrepreneur, you need to have an MTP. It's your highest level aspiration. It connects your emotional drive with the moonshots you take on. Your MTP drives the direction of your moonshot. It allows you to pursue your grandest dreams. It fuels you to go 10x bigger and impact the world. So the question is, where do you go to discover your MTP, to hone your moonshot? Join me at Abundance 360. It's a global community of world changers, entrepreneurs, investors, philanthropists, all of whom have an MTP and a moonshot. We support each other in making a dent in the universe to positively uplift humanity. Our mission at A360 is to give you the tools, the network, and the inspiration to go big, again, to create wealth and to uplift humanity. If hearing this has you thinking, I want to be part of that, I need someone to help support my MTP and moonshot, then consider joining us. Submit your application at a360.com. That's a360.com. See you there. Now back to our podcast.